Hi, everyone. I'm here with Rigel Richardson, who has done some work in automatic drawing, exploring the psychological and physical. And she has done work with glyphs and sees art as a way to channel anxiety and sees it as a healing process. She is a CMU graduate and has also done work with youth. I'm really excited to be talking with her today. Welcome, Rigel.
Thank you so much.
So you do automatic drawing. What is that?
Yeah, well, back in my art infancy, I actually thought that I had developed this technique for myself. And then, you start digging into art history, and it turns out this is a practice that has been done since the beginning of time. But essentially, at its root, you take a surface, could be a painting surface or a piece of paper, and you take a mark making tool, maybe a pencil, even something like a Sharpie or a paintbrush, and you just let either your hand or your emotions, or in some cases, some kind of spiritual channel travel through you, and you make marks without intention. So a little bit like art Ouija board, something else is guiding your hand, or in my case, because I used it as a tool to channel my anxiety, when you have anxiety, sometimes the way that it manifests is creating all of this tension in your muscles over the course of the day or the week, and that can actually create this bodily sense of having to make gestures or express your emotions. And so for me, not being a vocal person or a very active person necessarily in the beginning, I was more interested in just letting that come right out of my wrist motion and my hand motion. I know you and I talked about the idea of action art. There's a whole category of art and art history called action art, where the artists use the gestures of their body and the limitations of their form to create these tactile works that record their motions and record the actions. So there's a little bit of that. But for me specifically, usually I use something low pressure, low level, like a colored pencil and some paper, and then just sit down and try not to pay attention to what I'm creating. And then I lay down some gestural line work. And then either I'll augment those lines and enhance those lines to create an image, or it will just be an activity that I did to release some of that tension, and break some of those thought loops that come with particular kinds of anxiety. And I do have some examples of how that evolves from line work to image, if you'd like to see those.
Sure, I'd love to.
Just last night, I did a few as an example, but they really do start off as just these very loose kind of lines. You can see they kind of vary in pressure. There's nothing really specific about them. And then there's this point after you get your mark making down and you get some of those, creative energies out into the paper. You have this point where you can reassess your lines and kind of meditate on them, and it gives you something to focus on that's not whatever is floating around in your internal landscape. And sometimes an image pops out, or sometimes it can just be pattern based. I do have some pattern ones that I can show you, but these ones in particular ended up becoming kind of little pop drawings. So the first stage is always to just enhance the lines that are actually there. And it can be a fast process, it can be a slow process. It's all kind of dependent on whatever's going inside, whatever's going on inside at the time. And then sometimes they just become these weird, fun little drawings. And I expressed to you before, a lot of times the construction of whatever figures or creatures show up in my drawings isn't necessarily tied to our physical reality. It doesn't necessarily feel believable. You might not be able to draw this creature in a different position, but because all of those lines are your natural motions and your natural energy, there's something that remains kind of believable in the end result. So, this hand doesn't even connect to that body, but somehow it feels like it could exist. So just another one, just some loose line work. You meditate on the lines. And the other thing I do is I'll usually rotate it until it feels like it feels right. Sometimes the lines have a particular weight, so I'll just look at it from every angle, look at it far away, look at it close. And that whole process of just stopping, assessing the lines really can put some space between your anxiety and your identification with your anxiety, which is one of those CBT tools that folks with anxiety usually use. Is how do you create space between the thoughts and the intrusive thoughts you're having and your ability to disconnect from them or identify with them. So this creates kind of an anchor for you to do that. You've developed a process that's easy, low barrier to entry. You just hop right in, and it gives you something to focus on. And really, very often after I make these weird little drawings, I'll feel a lot better, or I will realize something, or the content of whatever emerges in the line work is related to whatever I'm experiencing at the time.
I really see what you mean by like mark making.
Yeah, yeah,
And
and
the way you're talking about it, you said it helps you transmute anxiety and nervous energy. And I can see that in the way you're
yeah,
talking about it. It's turning off your controlling the part of your mind that wants to control what you're doing, and you're just kind of like being in a more maybe intuitive space,
exactly.
or just like a space where you're letting anything come out of you.
Exactly. Yeah. And I guess it has a little bit to do with mindfulness, being very present in that action and that assessment and the activity can do a lot to break your brain from dwelling on whatever was bothering you or falling into these patterns of panic and anxiety. Yeah, so that's true. And just because we're talking about mark making, these things they take every scale. I have a representation, but I've made like a 5 by 7 foot painting. Sometimes they're itty bitty, sometimes they're in colored pencil, sometimes they're drawings, sometimes they're creatures, sometimes they're just patterns and shapes and shadows, and basically just like any way that I can get that energy out and onto the paper is going to be better than stalling and dwelling on whatever is going on. And sometimes they go on to be things that I'm very interested in artistically. They become finished works, or I can transform them into something that I would like to share with an audience. But so many of them are never seen. They're just a process that I developed for myself.
And you had also mentioned how this takes the pressure off of producing a polished work, or what we think would be a polished work.
Right. Yeah.
This is
So
way more natural or organic.
exactly. You mentioned that I went to school at Carnegie Mellon. I didn't start in art there. I started in computer science and electrical engineering, which are both very high pressure fields. And all the academia at CMU is very intense. And there's this pressure across the university, including in the art program, to be the best, to produce the best, to change the world. And even in the art program is not your traditional fine art program. There's a lot of art programs around the country where you go through traditional tracks like illustration or painting or digital design. The art program at Carnegie Mellon is conceptual art. So it's very contemporary, very kind of boundary pushing, cutting edge. They want you to engage with present art world narratives and political movements and that sort of thing, which is entirely possible because it's a great network, and it's entirely possible to do that in sort of a sustainable and rewarding way on either a national scale or even just a local scale. But when you're immersed in that environment, sometimes you start to lose sight of the fact that if you are expected to be your absolute best every second of every day, then you no longer have a best. That becomes your normal, and it can be a burnout. And you forget to take care of yourself, or you forget to explore ideas that are exciting to you. And sometimes folks can get away from the idea of understanding why they're doing something and just being caught up in, well, what can I produce? What can I sell? What will people want to see? And there's a pressure to create things that are polished and finished and great every time. But you can't make great art that way. You can't be a whole human that way. You have to slow down and explore ideas and take care of yourself and do a lot of experimentation and fail a lot. That comes up again. You have to fail in order to succeed. But in particular environments, especially academic environments, there's not necessarily the room for that. You just have to keep running. So after graduating, I finally had the space, well, sort of had the space. My career right after graduation was still high pressure, but I developed a space for myself to slow down and just be present and realize that there are other kinds of value in making and art making besides how much can you sell this for and how many high level conversations can you have around what you're creating.
And you have done some work with youth through a program called Hiccup.
Yeah, so I haven't actually done it successfully. The pandemic co, you know,
Yeah.
happened exactly when our workshop series was going to be, but last April or May, we were lined up to do a workshop for this process. Um, and I was going to teach kids to just make marks. We were going to work with some acrylic paint because they're really street art focused. And so we were going to use these things that are called mops, which graffiti artists usually use. Um, and it is basically just like kind of a bingo dauber. It has a little round sponge at the end, and you apply pressure to the bottle, and it makes these really beautiful thick lines. So just I thought that was a really nice tactile introduction. It's just you don't have very much control over this tool. It's going to flow very well, and you have to really exert some pressure to get the paint onto your surface. And all of that would combine to give you just the perfect introductory experience to using your body physically to take that energy and make a mark.
Hmm. And you said that everyone is creative by default.
Yeah, and this is something that has been solidified for me again and again while I've worked at the art store. I work as the assistant manager at Artists and Craftsman Supply, which is an employee-owned art store. But even when I was just a clerk, the one thing that our art store does a little bit more intensely than other art stores is we have a lot of time to dedicate to product project we have a lot of time to dedicate to project exploration and product education. So someone will come in and say, hey, I would like to start in watercolors. How do I do that? Or and it goes all the way through, hi, I'm a master gilder. Do you have a particular supply that I need? So we have this great range of conversations, but invariably, at least once a day, sometimes several times a day, friends and companions will come in with the artists who are shopping, and they'll denigrate themselves. They'll say, oh, I'm not creative. I could never do what so and so does. I'm not an artist. And I take that very seriously. Every time I hear someone say that, I engage them and say, you know what? You are probably very creative in a way that you're discrediting or that you might not think other people recognize. Maybe you make beautiful spreadsheets if you're a data analyst. Maybe you have just lovely code if you're a computer programmer. Maybe you just make beautiful chopped vegetables every time you prepare food for your family and artful plating. There's some aspect of being a human and interacting with your world and other people that is creative. And there's a kind of magic and serious potential in that. And I try to get people to understand that even if they're not creating master paintings or selling their work, and even if people never see the creative work that you do, you can still be creative, and there's a lot of power in that.
Well, you express that so well.
Thanks. My favorite thing, actually, since we're talking about working with youth, my favorite thing is when parents or grandparents or guardians will bring kids into the art store, and you can tell that either someone has discouraged them or they're used to other kinds of retail establishments being like a landscape of authority. And so they're very shy, they're very withdrawn, they have to kind of communicate through their guardian. But all of us try to cultivate an atmosphere where every single person that walks through that door is respected and exalted almost in their ability and whatever stage of life and creativity they're at. So we talk directly to those kids, and we figure out what it is they like making, what it is that excites them about making. And almost every time, by the end of their time in the store and the end of their conversations, you can see they've opened up and they feel like they're in charge of their own creativity, and that they have more say in what they want to do with their life than they thought before they walked in the door, which is, it's mind-blowing to me that you could go into a store and have that experience. Yeah. But that's something that I'm very proud of, having kind of nurtured in all of my coworkers, is not just running the store really well, but treating every person that comes into the store as a creative human.
Mm-hmm. And you mentioned talking about political movements or expressing that.
Much like there's this pressure to create something polished, sometimes I feel like there's this internal pressure to do more, to be more active, to be more sacrificial. And I always have to remind myself and my entire network that there are entry points for activism and allyship at every level. You don't always have to be the person at the front lines with the megaphone, leading the march. You don't always have to be, the folks in block protecting people from the gas canisters. You could also just distribute flyers. You can have conversations with your neighbors. You can donate a small portion of your disposable income to causes in your neighborhood. So I end up doing a lot of those lower level kind of participations, but my work hasn't really engaged with that recently, because it's mostly been about, what can I make when I have time to make it. And you and I talked about the fact that, you can see some of the work in the background and some of the work that I've shown, they're not necessarily indicative of any particular kind of conversation. They're almost like pieces in isolation. And I think that's why the automatic painting and drawing practice is much more personal and psychological and introspective, because it is more related to whatever I'm going through at the time, or whatever conversation I've had or experience I've had, and less about necessarily something that's going on in the world. But that's not always strictly true. It's just that I haven't found a way to connect those conversations to what's going on. For example, I'm sure a lot of people are aware of what's going on in Colombia and Costa Rica right now, and a lot of my work does dabble in like cultural roots and cultural experience, and I'm sure that there's a way to connect those two things in a productive or fruitful way, but for now they just kind of exist in my life, and they haven't really found a platform or a way to support those causes and messages.
What are some of your feelings and thoughts about maybe what's going on in Colombia or Costa Rica?
Yeah, just in case no one is aware, for over 100 days, Costa Rica has been in a declared state of emergency for the violence against women. They've had so many murders of women and so many disappeared women that the entire place is in an actual state of emergency because of the frequency and severity. But it's a US colony essentially, and the US doesn't want to talk about it or publicize it, and it's not really getting a lot of amplification. And I feel like most governments are also taxed by the whole pandemic context, so there's just this inundation of global trauma and global change and violence that is maybe too spread over too many areas for a centralized assistance. So mainly I've been seeing people just, like I was saying, trying to amplify that message, get awareness, contact authorities, like advocate for intervention and government assistance and money to go to Costa Rica. And then Colombia is a whole other situation, because they're experiencing extreme violence from their government, and their police force, their militarized police forces now to the point where they are literally murdering citizens for protesting and demonstrating. And every time I see someone share their message, they're not sure if they're going to survive beyond what's going on. And those are just 2 points in the whole world where everything is tumultuous. We have our own uprisings and demonstrations here in the United States, and The situation in India is terrible, and everyone is still finding their way through the pandemic in addition to all of these political conflicts. And um, sometimes it's really hard to feel hopeful or to feel effective as a human or to feel like a good neighbor. Because if you open the news or Twitter or any social media feed and you're inundated with at least 10 different issues in the last hour, and you start to wonder, how can you be a human? How can you be a human? But how can you be a creative person or just a person navigating the world when there's all of this that you could dedicate your entire life to? You could sacrifice every minute of your time trying to better the situation for other folks, and you still wouldn't necessarily make a dent. And I think that during the pandemic, we've really started to understand how collective action and community support and community gathered resources can make a bigger difference than just one person railing against something so big. So personally, I use processes like my automatic process to kind of just keep level. How do you find your way through the current global situation day to day and still feel kind of level and hopeful? The only way is to combat your particular anxieties or your particular, work with your particular neurodivergences and do what good you can for your family and your community, and then what you can for your global community. So that's how I've been trying to be a good neighbor and a good citizen, is what can I do to help my circle, and what can I do to help my city and my neighborhood, and then if I can, what can I do to help situations outside of that context, but um, balanced with making sure that you survive so that you're able to continue contributing in that way.
Violence against women is also something that I'm very passionate about about, and specifically also with Native Indigenous women in the
Yeah,
United States and women in general, like
yeah,
with domestic violence and so forth. And it's very interesting. There is this guy, his name is Jackson Katz, and he does a lot of work in um, you can say helping women with abuse and violence.
yeah,
And he says, we often term these things as women's issues.
yes,
And he said it's men's issues.
absolutely.
So the way we word this and the efforts that need to be made around this shouldn't just be coming from women.
Right.
So I mean that I thought was really interesting, and I'm grateful for his work.
I've been switching to writing. I've challenged myself to do writing every morning for an entire year, and I'm on day 106. So I've kind of shifted my focus to writing and what I can do with that, because I do own a publishing business with my husband. But everything is small. I mean, that's one thing that I feel like plays into uh, engaging with global political issues or local political issues, or just humanitarian efforts, is I'm not a famous artist. I don't have a great following. As much as I would like to use my platform for good, the reach is pretty small, especially in a context where TikTok users reach multi-million number views.
I
And
know.
I know where you can, if you feel like you've started to make it, if you have tens of thousands of followers on Instagram, um, I it's sometimes it feels like it's not necessarily helpful to share what I do, but I know that it is, because I've had conversations with people in my city. So much like you're saying, violence against women and things that impact women are not just women's issues, they're human issues, they're men's issues. I think that any way that you can express your position on an issue or disseminate information is going to be valuable, because then there's just more of it in your community and more of it in people's awarenesses. And I think especially related to Black Lives Matter and violence against Indigenous women and some of the issues that are at our forefront in the United States, the best, most influential encapsulations of that information have been artistic. Either they're creative interpretations of data, or they are someone's illustration, or their poetry, or their songs. And there's all of these ways that creators and artists are repackaging that information, not necessarily to make it palatable, but because they feel strongly about it, and it gets to their audience, and then it gets shared. So even if it feels like your reach is small, I think it's always worth being vocal about if you care about the issue. Unrelated, here are some of my glyphs. So they're kind of hard to see. They don't record very well optically, because some of the colors are neon and they really do change based on the light pattern. But it's another situation where it starts off as this gestural kind of line work, and then there's this repetitive activity of creating all of these little tick marks, if you can see those. Those are based on the little line patterns on alejebres, those Oaxacan Mexican wood carvings of creatures. But again, that's just like, here's my tiny art meditation for a day or two. But where does it go from there? I'm not sure. So I
That
keep
is
making,
so cool.
yeah.
That
And
is
there's a couple different colors. But again, I'm always trying, because I'm so busy with work, and because everyone is so brought down to some extent by the pandemic and the extended weirdness of that, I'm always finding ways that have low hurdles to make. Let me put a pencil to a page. Let me make one meditative paint line. Let me, cut up some paper. Whatever gets you making something and doing something and creating something, instead of just uh, feeling like you're stagnating or stewing, or running yourself into a panic. Anything that gets you out of thinking mode and into doing and making mode has always been really valuable to me, and I feel like that is something that I would love to share with more people, especially people who feel like they're not creative.
I wanted to ask you a little bit about your Mexican heritage.
Yeah. Just to give you my background, I am Mexican. I identify as Chicana with an X. In like the 70s and 80s, the activist term was Chicana, CH, to express that you were Mexican American. But there is a lot of move towards endonyms. I'm not sure if you're familiar with the term endonym, but I think that's correct. But the native name for a place or a people that they have given themselves. So, a lot of people will refer to the United States by its particular native region. There's this beautiful map that shows you what portions of the US were occupied by which Native Americans. And so you can identify the land where you are by the people that used to occupy it pre-colonialism. But similarly, Mexicans are the Mexica people. And so I just use the X to indicate that I am interested in engaging in those kinds of conversations. But also Chicana, because I recognize that I have contributions from both my United States citizenship and American heritage and my Mexican ancestry. I was thinking about it this morning, and it's kind of hard to conceive of, but I am actually only second generation American. My grandparents were Mexican citizens, born and raised. They immigrated here when they were old enough to get married, and they started their family in the United States. So my mom is first generation, but I'm second generation. And I think that there's always a danger when you are an artist of color or an artist with a distinct ethnic background or cultural background to get pigeonholed by both critics and audience members and other artists even and organizations. I mean, it goes to every level, if you say I'm a Mexican artist, then arts funders will say, oh, well, you should make Mexican art. Like, we'll fund your Mexican art. And if you try to step outside of that, sometimes they're like, well, aren't you Mexican? Why aren't you, I don't know, painting nopales or whatever it is that they conceive of as what a Mexican artist or any other kind of artist would be making. So I feel like my heritage and my experience comes out more in the mark making that I was talking about and the color palettes and some of the subject matters. You can see in the background, it's not quite clear, but I keep pointing to this little painting just because it's so present. Uh, that's a painting that I call the Tres Muertos, which was this weird vision that my grandma had right before she passed away of these three dead guys standing in her doorway trying to take her away, which is really upsetting, but it was a nice way to transmute that kind of unsettling energy into something that's a little bit more approachable. So there's just these three skeleton guys, stylized in the way that Mexican art usually portrays, especially for Dia de los Muertos or any of those celebrations that deal with the dead. Calaveras or skeletons are they're kind of a stand-in for ghosts. And they're very animated and they're very present and they're not usually scary. They're just a representation or a metaphor for whatever it is, however you carry yourself and your spirit through the world after you leave your body. So there's these guys, and they have an abalone shell full of marigolds, which I think are, I'm going to butcher it, but it's like cempasúchil flowers, which the Aztecs used in a lot of their culture and Mexicans use during the Day of the Dead celebrations as a flower and a color to anchor the spirits and call them home. And the abalone is there because my grandparents settled on Catalina Island off the coast of California before they started their family. And my grandpa had a big hand in building some of the infrastructure for the cities there. So like a lot of the stonework and public infrastructure that's part of Avalon, which is the main port city, he and his family built and were involved in constructing. So, that's a perfect portrait of this is a story directly from my grandmother. It's an experience she had, and it is recorded and translated in some of the iconography or the visual language of Mexican art. But I don't know that anyone else looking at this painting without that context would understand that necessarily. I think you have to have some familiarity with Mexican art and Mexican cultural practices to really understand that that's what is infused in my art. I mean, right next to it, I won't grab it off the wall, but I've also been doing these series of semi-automatic paintings, I would call them, called saguaro thoughts, where I'm just kind of meditating on desert landscapes and the idea of these very old cacti. And it's really funny if you look at them, they take the strangest forms. A lot of them will be growing at odd angles and they'll be top heavy and they'll be such strange shapes and they look alien, they look unreal. And so the automatic process can actually generate cacti that look closer to real cacti than you would believe without having seen one. So it's this weird interplay of this is not real, but it is actually real. And saguaros are important too, and they're so old, and they're an incredible part of human history and Mexican culture and cacti generally. I mean, I think mentioning nopales because they're a food source. They're the cactus that those little white bugs grow on, where you get that really beautiful rose madder color from, carmine. So yeah, there's like all of these little kind of, I guess they're not strictly Easter eggs because if you know what you're looking for, you can see them immediately. But there are these metaphors and subtle indications of my background, which are used not necessarily to say anything about my heritage. They're these standalone kind of little works.
Yeah, exactly. When you were talking about being pigeonholed, It's like, oh, you're Mexican. Why don't you make Mexican art? It's like,
Yeah.
okay, thank you. That's a nice suggestion. But sometimes, like, I grew up doing Indian classical dance,
Mm-hmm.
and my mom did it for both reasons, so that we were exposed to our culture and she wanted us to be dancers.
Yeah.
And luckily, we weren't forced into it. We had a passion for dance, we
Yeah.
enjoyed it. But the way I view it is very much that it's art. Even culture to me is always seen through an artistic lens. There's a separation there for me.
Right.
And also, art is just an act, it is a way for me to connect with like minded people.
Right. Yeah.
Culture, obviously, cultural awareness, it's extremely important.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but art, I think, has just been a bit devalued in our society and in schools. People aren't really seeing in mainstream society that connection there, that it's not something you do just to like color at home.
Yeah.
Like, it's not just an activity, a passing activity. It is work. It is self improvement. It is health. It is mental health. It's all of those things. Like a doctor, let's say, a doctor enjoys or does his or her work because maybe medicine is that's the way they think.
Yeah.
So artists, exactly, that's just the way that they think.
I think it's just an expression of your being and your spirit, and it unless you're really trying to say something specific, I don't see why artists should get pigeonholed at all. In fact,
Mhm.
that's been a point of frustration for me and other local artists. I mean, Pittsburgh's not a very big city. Our art scene isn't as well funded or well patronized or shiny necessarily as New York or Los Angeles,
Mhm.
but our art community is still really vibrant and our artists are still incredible. But some of the ways that you can engage with the art world and get funding and share your work with a wider audience are still stuck in those classical ideas of, well, you're a sculptor, you should make sculpture and only sculpture, or you're a portrait painter, you should be making consistently shaped, consistently valued portraits. And I mean, just through the few samples of work that I've shown you, I showed you a 7-foot painting, I showed you these little paintings on paper, I showed you some drawings. I My brain is never satisfied doing the same thing all the time or painting the same images or necessarily using the same colors, even though you can kind of see my color palette sort of settled. But the idea that you have to stop and limit your self-expression for the sake of being considered a more valuable artist or for your art to be more valuable is always so absurd. Why couldn't you and I go and do a dance performance together and then also turn around and I would paint your portrait? And why are those two things not equal if we did them in the same period of time? If we're supposed to be the creators and the channel of interpretation and the channel of expression, why is it that the world expects that to come out the same way every time? I love how collaborative projects like that can amplify both kinds of art and really change the narrative and the experience for the audience. You're not thinking of it as a static charcoal drawing to interpret, and you're not thinking of necessarily the dance as a dance to understand. You're thinking of it as this synthesis and this collaborative living kind of expression. And for me, that's much closer to living as an artist and being a human. You don't, even if you feel like you're not a creative human, you don't have a consistent art practice, let's say. um, I don't think anyone really does the same thing day after day, unless that's like part of your part of your habits. So maybe someone, like, I have habits that I do every day. I get up and write, but I don't write at the same time. But there are people that develop habits and routines for themselves. But I think that they approach everything they do slightly differently, depending on the temperature, depending on their feeling, depending on what conversations they had the day before. And I think that it's just as valid and valuable and creative to do many different things, many different ways, as it is to develop a portfolio of large scale portrait paintings that all have the same color palette and all kind of explore the same idea.
Exactly. And like even in a profession where what we might like perceive that, oh, they're just doing the same thing every day, but there's different tasks, there's different, ways of approaching and evolution of
Yeah,
of those things. So
arts funding and not necessarily arts patronage. I mean, you're producing this for your Patreon. So there are platforms now that understand the fluctuation of creative life and the fluctuation of human life and the variation in creative output. There are some platforms and ways to engage audiences that are reacting to that. But especially now, when you could go spend a whole week on YouTube and learn an entirely new skill or medium, and then create it and share it with hundreds of people the next week. I think that some of the support systems in place for arts and artists are falling behind the times a little bit. I think they are going to have to, maybe they don't have to, maybe they're big enough that they are stuck in their ways, but I would love to see them react. And our favorite pandemic catchphrase, time to pivot, it's time to pivot. I would love to see them pivot and embrace creators who are more sporadic and more exploratory and more varied in their creative output, because I mean, all those people, maybe I'm biased, but I feel like all of those people have valuable contributions to our conversation, no matter the scale or the context.
like you were saying, Pittsburgh has a very decent art scene.
Yeah,
But we can always improve. We have to create those opportunities ourselves as artists.
right.
There's like that quote that says like two is more powerful than one or something like that. I'm a big partnership person because that's where you can really be powerful and really make a change. So the more we get connected,
Yeah.
the more the like-minded of us get connected, who knows what we can create out of that.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, the one thing I was going to say, it's just a side note. You were saying about how you have your categorizations or pigeonholes in the painting world. Like, are you going to be a portrait painter? Or are you going to be? I'm thinking like as a painter, you must have like painters must have much more of that than maybe dance, because in dance,
Well,
yeah,
not sure. I think maybe there's more of that that's easy to latch onto just because painting, I mean, dance has a very long history too, but painting has a very long public art history, an institutional history, and a very moneyed history, because most of what we would consider the classical masters were just commissioned painters. Basically, they survived by having wealthy people pay them to paint their paintings, and then those paintings ended up in the museums and private collections. But just thinking about dance, I can think of at least 10 kinds of dance and how differently those are shared with the world and how differently those are approached. Dance is something that I've been more interested in recently, just because for most of my life I was very shy and nervous human who thought they had no rhythm.
oh,
uh, but again, just like automatic drawing, as long as you're moving your body and enjoying it, that's sometimes the important part. You don't have to look as aesthetically beautiful or curated as a professional dancer in order for that activity to be valuable to you. So movement has been of interest to me. But like there's hip hop dancers who engage with music videos or go to competitions, or there's battle dancers who do this for their own small communities, and then there's cultural dancers like you may have engaged with, where sometimes you're representing your cultural heritage and sharing that part of your history and your uh, person with a bunch of people. And there's just like all of these forms of expression too. And again, I think there's a lot of kinds of dance that get devalued or
mhm.
overlooked. I had the great pleasure and cool opportunity to actually go to one of the Vogue balls. I don't know if you're familiar with voguing in the queer history, but it was really largely part of the Black community in early queer history.
Oh, okay.
And there are actually still contemporary Vogue balls in Pittsburgh around the city, and
No
you would never know
way.
it. Yeah, you would never know it because you have to be part of that community to be
Yeah.
invited into that space. Um, I had a friend and classmate named Harrison Apple, who is now a really incredible queer historicist and linguisticist. um, but he does incredible historic work for the queer community, and he was able to document one of the balls here in Pittsburgh. And so I was like part of his little camera crew. And it was such a magical experience because it's both part of my community and really not part of my community. Like, just because I am a queer human doesn't mean that I belong in those particular spaces. But that's another incredible, beautiful, intimate kind of dance experience and expression that I feel like gets devalued all the time because of its complex history with both the Black community and the queer community.
Hmm.
And I mean, we know how complicated that whole thing is, but that I think probably every single kind of art has all of these little granular categorizations where some of them are more mainstream accepted and supported and funded, and then some are overlooked, and then some are outright dismissed for who knows what reason, racism often, but also just a lack of understanding, maybe a lack of education. I'm thinking of social practice. Social practice wasn't super well funded, I guess, funded or accepted or welcome until I'd say like 10, 15 years ago, because there was a lot of footwork to educate the public and educate the institutions about the value. I don't know if you're familiar with social practice, but the idea behind social practice is that you as an artist create an experience or a situation, and the artwork is actually the activation from the audience. It's what the audience experiences, or it's the way that the work transforms as an audience engages with your work. So it's not actually the work itself, it's this kind of ephemeral experience that changes every time you either install the work or put on the work, or however it is constructed. And one of the big groups that gets pointed to historically is the Fluxus groups. In the 60s and 70s, there were all of these artists who would create these happenings. So they would just kind of descend on a place and create an art event, sanctioned or unsanctioned. And it would be an experience for whoever was there. Maybe this is a direct reference to any of their work, but just like the idea of being in a park and suddenly all of these dancers appear, and there are these musicians that come out of the woodworks, and they put on an entire dance composition and musical performance for you, and then they just recede back into the city, that kind of thing. So like flash mobs in the early 90s and the 2000s, I think there's been more and more exposure to the idea that art can also be an experience, and not just like a static object. So now it's a little bit more supported and accepted by institutions. But before that, it was just people doing it because they wanted to do it, because that's how they wanted to express themselves. And it was certainly valuable to the creators and absolutely valuable to anyone who had that weird experience at the time. Um, yeah, I guess we kind of got off track, but my point is, I think there's just such an incredible diversity in every kind of medium and expression, and we I wish we regarded every kind of creativity as equally valid and equally valuable, and encouraged everyone to create however they feel most passionate creating.
I love that. And yeah, it's an experience like in Indian classical dance. I learned a style called Bharatanatyam. But in general, there's 6 or 7 types of classical dances in India. And the point of it is you're dancing, you're supposed to elevate the audience towards a spiritual experience
Yeah,
to help them connect with God or consciousness or whatever.
yeah.
It's interesting to me. I've always tried to understand the relationship with painting a little bit because painting the object that is has resulted, or at least what we call the object, came from an experience, didn't it?
Well,
Or a process.
yeah, well, it's hard to say
It is
because
hard to say, isn't it?
it's
It's
hard,
just
yeah,
so hard to say. It's just art.
yeah, it's hard to say. I mean, if we go back, let's go back all the way.
Yeah.
I mean, the origins are the origins we generally paint to, the origins we paint to, the origins we point to are generally, you know, they're not lithographs, but paintings on rocks. Anything that was recorded um, pre-written language or you know, I
Hmm.
guess not necessarily pre-oral language, but in what we would consider prehistoric human history, just marks on rocks or paintings on rocks, cave paintings, the paintings at Lascaux, which also, I don't know if you know this, but in like the last decade, someone finally discovered that um, those paintings, they look really fragmented. So for a long time, people thought that, oh, humans were just so primitive, they couldn't even see properly. It's so dumb.
Yeah.
Yeah. But they're really fragmented and they have like these odd angles, and some of them aren't a complete creature and some of them have indications of like two postures. But it turns out that when you light a fire in the cave, they're actually animations.
Hmm.
So, sometimes the thing that you think of as just an object or a record of an experience is so much more than that. And who knows if those were even actual experiences, the same way that authors can synthesize what they know into some fictional narrative where it's not quite an experience that they had, but it's probably related to something that they know or experienced and it's new. I feel like painters and every other kind of artist can do the same. You're always remixing
Hmm.
your experience and your language and the visual language of the world. So sometimes it's an experience, sometimes maybe it's an actual spiritual experience. Sometimes it's paint for paint's sake. There's that another whole category of painting where it's about the materiality of the painting. People like to talk about, Jackson Pollock. My feelings on him are a little bit more complicated because I think there's more spiritual synthesis there than people necessarily give credit. But just the idea of really forefronting the material. So a painting could be about the fact that it's made of paint instead of what it looks like or how it makes you feel or what the painter was trying to say at the time. Just
Hmm.
I don't I don't know. That's hard.
That's
Same way, like dancing, since dancing is your primary medium, you have this beautiful practice and cultural heritage of uplifting the audience to a spiritual experience. And it's funny you should say that because I feel like the most beautiful dance performances I've ever seen, regardless of the genre, have that sense about them. You just get absorbed into the moment and elevated, and there's this energy in the room that's cultivated by sharing this experience. But I forgot my train of thought too. Yeah, it's hard to say. I think that every art could either be an object or a record or an experience or the shared experience, I guess.
I think what you just said at the end, like elevating to spirituality, I feel like our entire conversation ended it like we're in that now, you know?
Yeah, yeah, I hope you as the audience can feel that with us, but especially when you have good conversations with people, any kind of shared experience. But when I was doing some social practice work, uh, my favorite vehicle for creating that kind of experience was sharing a meal with someone. Just the act of either cooking together or breaking bread together and eating and having a conversation and being in the same space and doing something that would make you vulnerable as an organism. Like if you stop to eat as a deer, you're open to predators. If you stop to eat as a human, you're also vulnerable to whatever someone's going to say to you, whether you're going to get attacked. That's not present in our modern world, but I feel like our bodies still remember that. And so you're sitting down and you're doing this very vulnerable human thing with each other. And, if you're talking directly to someone or you're eating with someone, or even if you're just standing at the bus stop with someone, whatever your shared experience is, I think really shifts the energy of the participants if they remain open to whatever is going to happen, if they don't try to close yourself off. There have definitely been times where I have had the opportunity to engage with folks that are at my bus stop and I'm just not in the right frame of mind. But then there are other times where, I don't know what it is. The light is right. Our moods are right. We're wearing the right shoes. Who knows what it is, but someone will just say something and engage you in conversation and you start realizing how much you have in common, and any little conversation or any little shared experience to me does that. It elevates you. It reminds you that you are a conscious being. You are the synthesis of everything you ever experienced, and you're the collection of all of the stories and information that other people have shared with you. And I think that's really special, and I try to think about that in my art. I'm not sure that ever is something that's really strongly conveyed in my art, but it's always kind of in the back of my mind. And I feel like the best art experiences I've had or had a hand in shaping have been that way.
Hmm. I want to thank you so much
Yeah,
for talking with me today. You speak so beautifully,
thank you.
and you have so much knowledge, and I think especially our young viewers will really appreciate your perspective.
Thank you. Yeah, it was so lovely to speak with you, and I'm happy to have been here. It was very fun, but also, yeah, I think this is a nice point to end on. We do feel elevated in some way, and I think that's the best you can possibly hope for any kind of interaction.
Absolutely. I feel I share the same feeling.
That's great.
You.
Well, it was so lovely to talk to you. Thank you so much for the opportunity, and I hope we work together in the future. And thank you for making this available to people. I know it's available on your Patreon. I'm excited to let other people know that this is a series that you're working on. I can only imagine what beautiful, valuable conversations you're going to continue to have with artists and other humans. So thanks for letting me participate, and I'm so excited to see who else you talk to.
Sure. Thank you so much for your kind words.
Of course, yeah.
We'll be in touch.
Okay, bye.
Okay, dear. Bye.